Good evening, SIAS members, investors. Tonight's Investor Forum is on key insights for investors, understanding the function of boards and subcommittees. Over the last 25 years at SIAS, I've come across questions from retail investors asking me to explain how a decision was made in the boardroom. Unfortunately, I cannot sit in a boardroom. I'm not a director. And there are many misconceptions about directors. It is a very onerous job. It is a job that is very liable. There's liabilities that the directors face. And yet, very often, there is misunderstanding about the role of directors. So we decided to collaborate with the most important organization for directors, and that is the Institute of Directors. And we thought that we should have the opportunity to ask directors who are experienced and who have been running the Singapore Institute of Directors, who've been governing, to take questions, your questions and SIS questions, to explain very simply how the board of directors function. Annually, the engagement between shareholders and board of directors usually takes place only once a year at the company AGM, unless there is an EGM for a corporate action or a vote required, then there may be more than once, but very rarely. Most of the shareholders have the understanding on the basic key rules of the boards and subcommittees, but not in details. So the board, as the governing body of a company, sets a strategic direction, ensures financial health, and upholds the company's mission and vision. It supervises the management. The subcommittee is composed of board members with comprising of board members with specific expertise focus on distinct areas of the company's operations, and they also provide a platform for non-board members with specific skills or knowledge to contribute to the company's governance. Now, as you know, there are a few subcommittees that the board appoints, and that is the audit committee, which ensures compliance with financial reporting requirements, nominating committee, responsible for board members' recruitment and governance issues, remuneration committee, which sets the compensation for senior executives, finance committee, which oversees the financial health of the company, risk committee, which identifies and mitigates potential risks, and finally, the ethics and compliance committee, which ensures ethical operations and compliance with the laws. In this webinar, investors can learn how boards and subcommittees function. Investors can also gain an understanding of assessing boards' effectiveness, the potential risks involved, and the overall governance of the company. This knowledge is important in evaluating the company's prospects and stability. It is important because you want to choose the right company for your investment. Okay, now, I'm very, very pleased to introduce two distinguished personalities. And first is Mr. Adrian Chan. He's Vice Chair, Singapore Institute of Directors. He's a corporate lawyer with many, many years of experience. He knows the company's sex upside down. He knows the corporate governance code. And he has been on several boards, I believe, Adrian. You have served in a few boards. And the pretty lady here, Ms. Wong Su Yen, the immediate past chair of Singapore Institute of Directors. She also sits on boards. So they are very experienced on boards, and they know how the board functions. So we invited them to, first of all, answer some of the questions that I have prepared with my colleagues, and then we will take questions from the audience. We got, I think, 100 over, nearly 120 or 130 people tonight. So please bear with them. It is an education and informative session. So let me start with Su Yen. With the various committees supporting the board, how do you measure their effectiveness?
Thank you, David, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone this evening. I think when you look at effectiveness of committees and you articulated some of the committees that a board might comprise of, you want to look at it through both quantitative and qualitative measures. So, for example, if we use the committee as a reference point, you might look at how frequently or how severe there might be financial restatements, and this might be a negative indicator in terms of whether the committee is discharging their work together with, obviously, with management. On the other side, positive indicators could include the timeliness of financial disclosures, the outcome of external audits, and so you get a sense of the level of audits, the findings and what those findings are. For the remuneration committee, you could look at effectiveness by analyzing the link or alignment between compensation and performance, right? And how this compares to industry benchmarks. So there are a number of ways that you can get an indication of how well the committees are functioning.
So that again brings me to the main board. How do you engage an external expert to assess the effectiveness and the performance of the committees as well as the boards? You see, I just am wondering how this happens, because people out there who come for meetings come back and say, this board, But let me tell you, in Singapore, we are very fortunate to have honorable men on the boards, but there are some where you have problems, with the boards and not performance of the boards. So the question is, how do you actually measure? How do you actually measure the effectiveness of the board?
Yeah.
And let us zoom.
So
Okay.
many boards in Singapore use a self-assessment process where they
Yes.
assess the board's effectiveness, they assess the committees, so they go through each of the committees, and then they also look at the contribution of individual directors.
Right.
We'll look at the capabilities and experience that the board directors bring, and in totality, whether they have the skills and expertise required to lead the company. Having said that, you raised a great point, David, which is that it is good practice to actually engage an external perspective, can have an unbiased, unfiltered view at how well a board is functioning, carry out interviews with board directors about what they think is working well, what's working less well. I've been involved in some of these as well. And I think it's usually quite valuable for the board to then have this, reflective process to do a look back. What are some of the areas that we're doing really well, and what are some of the areas that maybe there's room for improvement, much as you would measure effectiveness of anything, right? You do a look back.
Yes.
Here are the gaps, and how do we close those gaps? So yes, I think we would be in favor of having more external perspectives.
Excellent. Now, Adrian, I want to ask you this when we are talking about the committees, about performance of the company's performance and insights, what they should ask the investors who come for AGM. What is the most important question you as a board member would expect from the shareholders to obtain insights into the company's performance? You had presided over quite a number of AGMs. Tell me, if only they could ask this.
Yeah, I actually, thanks for that question, David. It's great to be here again. I really enjoy these sessions with you. So if I were an investor asking questions of myself on the board, I think the best sort of question is one where, number one, the investor does his homework. So he knows what the value levers are for that business. He knows where the performance can most importantly be driven, what factors and considerations they are. So for example, if you're in real estate and interest rates are going up, then you would have done your homework. You know that actually what has the company done to deal with rising interest rates? What is the debt aging profile? When will the largest amount of debt be rolled over? What's your greatest risk? What is their average interest cost? And what's it going to look like in the future? So I think if the investor can do his homework, look at the sensitive areas. Is it customer concentration? Is it supply chain issues? Is it currency exposure? So if the investor can be armed with some homework, and then he drills down as hard as he can to the chairman and the executive directors on giving him as much inkling as to what their thinking is, especially with regards to risk factors, right?
Yes.
So what are they doing with AI, for example, now, you know? So I really think that investors should be a bit more focused in drilling down as to what is truly of value in the company, and ask them moving forward, how external events, internal events, how will that affect these drivers? If I'm an investor, I think that will give me the most value from this question and answer session.
Yeah, but you've been on board this at AGMs over the years.
Yeah.
But now nearly over 20 years, 25
Yeah.
years, you've been.
Yeah.
You think there is a trend that is showing that retail investors are more educated, more discerning,
for sure,
asking better questions?
I think 10, 20 years ago, we got fairly superficial questions by and large. And over the years, we see, I think in large part due to the education that SIAS has provided to the investor community, we've seen people coming to AGMs no longer asking for the print in the annual report to be enlarged. I mean, that's what we used to get, right?
Yes.
And it's fairly really mundane questions. And now, first of all, the investor average age has come down. We see a lot of youngish compared to me.
Yes. Yes.
Young professionals asking excellent questions, and even the more senior investors are also coming well prepared, and they cluster, right? So I think clustering and having your friends there helps because they talk amongst themselves and then they embolden themselves, and then they ask good questions. So I feel that SIAS has done a great job elevating the quality of analysis by the investors.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we are here to do that. But do you feel that they do understand the company's culture? Let me ask Suyen. The company's culture is very important. Culture of trust, culture of, accommodating the concerns of the shareholders, the culture of having to communicate effectively, the culture of being honest. All right. Are these factors there? I mean, Suyen, could you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so absolutely. Culture is being viewed as an increasingly important factor as to what drives ethical behavior, right? What drives doing the right thing. I think one of the areas that as an investor you can look at is the interaction and the dynamics. Even if you go to an AGM, for example, you can look at how the questions are answered. Are they answered, with a spirit of, openness, transparency, or or are they sort of a little bit obscuring sort of what the facts might be. Now, recognizing, of course, that there are certain things that certain companies are at liberty to disclose at certain points in time. So sort of recognize that. But I think the AGM is one mechanism, but then there is the ongoing communication. So how open and how much information does the company provide? So this could be, if there is an issue, whether maybe it's a cyber breach, how they're handling the cyber breach. In the case of the pandemic, how did they deal with employee health and safety? How these can give you a pretty good indication of the company's values, which of course is about tone from the top, both board as well as management. So I think you have to look for the clues.
Yes. So
Culture is it's very hard to put your finger in it, but you know it when you see it.
I see. Okay. Some years ago, when after starting SIAS, I used to get complaints that the chairman is not entertaining the questions. He's brushing us aside. He says noted, and then no answer given. But of recent years, more and more companies are willing to communicate, and they are coming to SIAS for dialogue sessions. That is a good development. But Adrian, how does a shareholder then know that the company upholds its stated values?
Yeah, well, the best way to ask the chairman is, Chairman, can you tell me what your values, mission, and values are?
Yes.
And I tell you, I think 80% of chairman will fail that test. They will
Yes.
say, they pass me the end report, let me go and check and read. So if they
Yes.
don't know it by heart, I think it shows that they don't live the values. But it's difficult to measure, honestly.
Yes.
Culture and values is difficult to measure. I think shareholders can smell it a mile away when the chairman is trying to pull a fast one on them.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
chairman really need to learn how to be honest and truthful to the shareholders.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one example, right? So
Yeah.
at many AGMs, shareholders ask, hey, how come you pay so little dividends? You're making so much money. Why don't you share some of that with shareholders? And
Yeah.
usually,
Yes.
whether I'm there as a director or there as an advisor,
Mm.
the chairman will give a roundabout answer. At the end of the day, you can tell whether he is actually listening to you or he's saying to you, we are not a REIT, we are not a dividend yield play, so don't hope to influence our thinking on dividends. That may be his
Mm.
message, but he may couch it in different ways. So I
Yes.
think ultimately shareholders can't force the board to declare more dividends, and they may have to accept that and then move on. But at least it gives them an idea, hey, is this board receptive to what we're saying or not?
Yes.
And I
So
think
there are well-governed companies and poorly governed companies. Communication, therefore, is very important. So, Suyan, what are the channels and platforms that boards should prefer in their communications with the shareholders?
Yeah, so I think, this being 2024, there are lots of channels actually. I mean, historically, obviously, the annual report, the AGM, are sort of the main mechanisms for communicating with shareholders. Of course, the investor relations team. Increasingly, I think we start to see much more real-time live communication, including on social media. So, you don't have to wait till, once a quarter or once a year. Actually, sometimes they're giving insights on, we've got a new, customer contract, in a particular location, and it's worth this much. So you get a better sense of what the company's working on a more continuous basis. I think back to the point that Adrian was making around openness of communication. I think as an investor, what I'm looking at is really clarity of that communication. Actually, it doesn't matter what the company's position is. I just need to know what it is so I can make my own decision whether this is appropriate for me or not, right? I mean, there are some that are growth plays, some that are dividend plays. There are lots of different mechanisms that we each think about constructing a portfolio. So that clarity and that transparency, I think, is what I think we try to look for.
See, Adrian, corporate actions sometimes, doesn't bring out with clarity the issues, and investors grope in the dark, but many, as you said, are now well educated, but there are many investors who do not understand the nitty-gritty of corporate action. So they come to SIAS, and then we get the companies to come and explain. There are many are willing to come on board and do communication through corporate our dialogue sessions. But let me ask you this: how does Adrian? How does the board communicate to shareholders on a timely manner the issues that arises from corporate actions?
Yeah, I mean, the primary way they communicate is through announcements on SGXNet. Yeah,
Yes.
and I think sometimes if they are not fulsome in their responses and updating shareholders, the exchange will come down and ask for clarification, and you know then that
Yes.
their first announcements have not been complete or comprehensive enough, so they have to clarify. But I think by and large, when the corporate actions and exercises are a bit more complex,
Yes.
then these investor forums that SIAS organizes, and on the board of First
Yes.
Street, we've worked with SIAS on quite a few occasions. We've really found that to be useful in reaching out to important shareholder groups, our retail shareholder base, to explain to them.
Yes.
And then we're prepared to sit down and talk to shareholders, and as long as it takes to get them to understand what we're trying to achieve.
And that does produce results, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, they understand the issues better. They don't hallucinate. They don't imagine.
We can't convince everyone, but at least we can get our point of view out there, and we can also absorb what are the concerns the shareholders have, so we can plan for the next exercise and plan moving forward. How do we try to address them?
So communication,
Yes.
right? And effective communication. And many of the retail investors don't go to the SGX net to understand the long statements, the voluminous, announcements. So it's easier to simplify it and have a meeting face to face and answer questions. In the meantime, we talked about AI technology. That is a thing that is going to happen and is happening. What role does the technology committee typically play in shaping company digital strategy? Adrian?
Well, every board should have an AI strategy, even if the AI strategy is maybe not yet, right?
Yes.
So I think the AI strategy needs to be looked at from two directions. One is, can the company itself adopt generative AI to sharpen its outreach to the market, to develop its offerings, and to deal with challenges and risks out there? Secondly, it should be also the other way around, where even if you choose not to use generative AI in your product offerings, how do you deal with generative AI out there amongst your competitors in the field, in the environment? How can you actually provide for obstacles to be identified way beforehand? So I think whether you have a technology committee or digital committee, there needs to be, and not all companies have CTOs or CISOs, information security officers. They need to have this expertise. If they don't have it in-house, they need to outsource it, right?
I see.
And if they don't have a digital director, they should engage and appoint a director who is familiar enough.
So Suyan, how does the committee assess and monitor technology-rated risk? How does it happen?
Yeah, so as with measuring and assessing all risks, the idea would be to have a risk register to look at what the technology-related risks are. And so, for example, one might be adoption of emerging technology, depending on what business the company is in, right? So if it's in the medical device space, for example, is a different type of technology that one needs to be concerned about. Could be around cybersecurity risks. So identify what the risks are, identify the order of magnitude that those risks present, and then the likelihood of them happening, and then putting in place mitigation measures. So one of the things that I think, besides generative AI, that a lot of boards are very concerned about now is the issue of cybersecurity, and what that means in terms of driving a risk-aware culture in the organization. Back to this point about culture, because a lot of cyber risks have to do with human factors, right? So how do you actually ensure that as a board, you're asking the questions of management to say, have we put in place, protocols, training, communication, change management, so that everyone down to the every single level of employee understands what those risks are, and you test it, and you do trials to see whether people are still clicking on those links, right? So yeah, I think these are some of the aspects around looking at technology risks that I think a lot of boards are quite focused on now.
Quite focused, but Adrian, really following up on that, the AI automation or digital transformation are topics that layman will find it difficult to understand, you know. So can you advise how a board can help investors understand how the technology has helped or hindered the company's operations?
Yeah, I think boards should explain to shareholders what their digital or technology roadmap is.
Yes.
And if they don't have one, shareholders should quiz boards why, right? Maybe it's they are in an old-fashioned real estate space and they don't feel that AI is useful in helping them predict when tenants will not pay their rent. But in all cases, I find that even REITs have space to actually adopt a lot of technology, both in managing your properties, identify credit risk tenants, collection issues. There are many, many ways that technology can help you. But like Suyan said, technology has its positive aspects and negative aspects. And, you know, for boards, we were frightened by the statistic that in January alone, just 1 month, 4 SGX listed companies were hit by ransomware attacks. So ransomware attacks are getting more and more common among SGX listed companies.
Yes.
And are your boards prepared? You should ask your boards, what
Yes.
happens if a ransomware attack hits you? Are you going to pay? What's your limit? Do you have insurance? Ask them these questions.
Yes. Now, let me pose to you the first question from the audience, from the participants today. Who ultimately appoints the board members and who has the final right to approve? Also, is there, you know, they're asking, is there any option for shareholders to remove board members if the shareholders feel these members are not performing? So who appoints? Is it the majority shareholder? You know, a lot of family-owned companies are
Sure.
listed. So
Happy to answer
one man
that.
decides and then he fills up the board and everybody say, aye, sir, and you agree? Yes, I agree. So the perception is that, you know, is controlled by one man.
Yeah, well, in Singapore, at least for listed boards, majority rules.
Yes.
Like so many other cases, even in our political arena, majority rules, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
it's practically it's first past the post, majority rules. So what happens in reality is the board actually has the power to add to the board, right? So the board has the ability, without consulting shareholders, to appoint a new director. But that new director must stand for re-election at the next AGM. So shareholders have a chance to quiz this director at the next AGM. Hey, who are you? What's your profile? Did you bluff your credentials and fake your university degrees? And how are you going to contribute? And then they can vote on his re-election. So SGX rules require newly appointed directors to stand for re-election at AGMs and for the rest of the board to actually stand for re-election once every 3 years. So at the AGM though, major shareholders can easily vote on their own appointment and the appointment of directors. So you need to find enough votes to support your resolution, whether it's to support his reappointment or against his reappointment. Yeah,
Hey,
basically you need
Adrian,
50% of those votes.
yeah, isn't it true? I mean, in New Zealand, if you want to be appointed as a director, you got to stand before the shareholders and explain why you are standing and what is your qualification and what is your relevance to the company, right? Why can't we introduce that? Why can't we have that in Singapore?
Yeah, I guess the thinking is if we do that, it might take too long before we can onboard a director, especially when he's needed to replace an outgoing one who's retiring or resigning. So our system follows the English system where he just stands before shareholders at the next AGM. The next AGM can be a few months away or can be practically a year away. So it's luck of the draw when he's appointed. Yeah. And you can quiz him. And I think Exchange has now required a lot more information about the director to be disclosed.
I see.
Yeah. A shareholder does have the opportunity at that AGM to look at the profile of the director, to ask questions to the director. So absolutely, they have the mechanism to do this.
Now, either of you could answer this. Is it true? The next question from the floor. Is it true that the directors don't bother much about retail investors? Therefore, their concerns are sidestepped, but are mainly concerned with the institutional investors who bring in big money. So
Maybe
yeah,
I'll
you
go
want to
first,
answer?
Suyen.
Are you okay? Okay. Yes.
I can share an example.
Yes.
So
Yes.
some companies do, I mean, as with all of these questions, there is no one size fits all answer because different
Yes.
companies have approaches. But some good practices that I think we've seen are, you know, the company tries to educate retail shareholders as well. So
Yes.
involve, you know, having, you know, a shareholder trip or, you know, sort of regular communication to help the shareholders understand the business. So it goes both ways. I think shareholders need to do their homework, as Adrian mentioned earlier, do your homework about the business, but equally the company can provide opportunities for the shareholders to understand the business. So I think it does vary from company to company, but there are examples of good companies who do take the trouble to engage with their retail shareholders.
Largely Temasek owned.
No, not
No.
necessarily.
No,
So,
no,
so
not
Suyen is
necessarily.
talking about, for
Family
example, Yoma.
companies.
She's on the board of Yoma.
Yoma, yes, yes.
Family, yeah, family has a reasonable stake, but it's, you know, listed. And, you know, when you think about the business in Myanmar, if you're a retail shareholder sitting in Singapore, it's very hard to understand what's happening in Myanmar, right? So exactly right.
Okay,
Yeah,
let me.
they organize shareholder trips, but I think it's not
Yeah.
really level playing field. So, for example, a lot of my boards, they do have separate sessions with institutional investors. And so institutional investors, when they knock on the doors, the IR head will talk to them, the finance guys will talk to them.
Right.
So I think it's true that retail shareholders probably have access mainly at AGMs,
Yeah.
at investor days or investor forums if the group organizes these things. So they
You
should
would-
use that opportunity as much as possible.
You would
Yeah.
advocate for effective investor relations function for listed companies.
Yeah, I think
That's
yeah.
important, right?
That's important. I think investor days are nowadays getting more and more common. Apart from the AGMs,
Right.
they allow people to dial in to ask questions, especially when there are major corporate exercises going on.
Yeah, that's because Corporate Governance Code, the last revision, introduced that Investor Day. Now, I feel sorry for one category of directors, the independent directors. Now, under the Companies Act, there is no independent directors. It was introduced in the Corporate Governance Code when it was, I think, the second of first revision. Independent directors are expected by minority shareholders to speak up for them and to champion their cause. At the same time, they have the duty spelled out in the Companies Act that they have to act for all shareholders, not only minority shareholders. So what is your view? What does he do? What is the dilemma here?
Yeah, shall I go first? So yeah,
Yes.
maybe I can just share that usually the ID is torn between both the majority and minorities. Especially since Singapore, we have a very large number of family-owned companies. So you have a majority of controlling shareholder.
Yes.
The perception is that the ID is there to protect minorities, mainly because the majority shareholder will already have directors he's appointed, right? So to even it up, and under our IPT rules, interested person transaction rules, under listing manual, the ID has a special role to play in ensuring that interested person transactions, IPTs, are at arm's length. So the ID does need to look after minorities. At the same time, he needs to earn the trust of the majority, because otherwise he will always be seen as an outsider. So the most effective IDs that I know earn the trust of both the majority shareholder and the minority shareholder. He's an effective bridge. Yeah,
Does
Suyen,
that
you want
help
to add to that?
Yeah.
Oh, Suyen, you're muted.
Very, very well put in terms of that balancing act. And the same would be said for an independent chair, for example, who needs to manage the shareholders. And the shareholders might not necessarily be family. It could be an institutional shareholder that has a large stake. It could be a private equity firm. It could be lots of different permutations where you have basically a major substantial shareholder that has its particular interest. It's perhaps a time horizon that it's looking at, thinking about how it has a broader view. So the ID needs to play that role. Having said that, the role of a director, whether independent or non-independent, is intended to look after the interests of the company overall. So even if you're a non-independent director, you are responsible, and a non-independent director is responsible for the affairs of the entire company, including looking after the interests of all shareholders.
So, I mean, the directors will have to either agree or disagree on matters. In your experience, both of you, in your experience on the board, how often do you actually see disagreement with the chair or with the majority? Does this happen? If that happens, is their tenure affected?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I
Yes.
think it's a big challenge.
Yes.
And personally, I wouldn't join a board if I don't trust the majority shareholder
Right.
to do the right thing, right? So I would only join boards where I think the majority shareholders are good guy or good fund, or has the interest of the company at heart. And I think if that trust is lost, I would leave. But the exchange doesn't like directors run away from trouble.
Yes.
So I've been on boards where we had short seller attacks. We've had our shares suspended for trading for over 2 years, and I don't run away. I try to save and stay and
Yes.
solve the problem, working with major shareholders. And sometimes we disagree. And I think part of the skill of an effective director is managing that disagreement. But it's not easy. If the disagreement is fundamental enough, I think you might need to find a replacement. So I recommend that all directors find useful and more effective replacements before stepping off boards.
Yeah,
If I add to that,
yes.
I think what's really important is to look at the tone and the board dynamics on the board, because there are a lot of very good companies out there where the chair and the majority shareholders and the non-independent directors are very open to input from their independent directors. So these companies do exist. So I hope that people don't feel that just because there is a major shareholder or just because there's a family stake means that the way they function is a particular way. Yes, there is a reason behind stereotypes, a certain type, but there are a lot of companies that function very well. And I think the trick here is, on a board, regardless of whether you are a non-independent or an independent director, whether you represent a shareholder or not, how do you get the balance right between challenge and support? Right? I mean, as an independent director, actually as any director, you want to be able to challenge management, you want to challenge strategy, you want to challenge the direction, right? Because it's about seeing, did we miss anything? Do we have any blind spots? Are we understanding the world as we see it? Do we have similar assumptions about the world? And if not, how can we align with that? So you want to challenge, but boards that are only about challenge are also fairly dysfunctional, right? So you need to balance the challenge and the support. On the other hand, if you have a board where it's all about support, whereas, regardless of what the strategy may be, basically saying, well, just go with what the CEO says, or just go with the chairman says, that's not constructive either, right? So this balance between challenge and support, I think, is something that's really key. And everyone on the board should have that same role of playing both of those challenging and support roles, regardless of whether you represent the shareholder, independent, and so forth.
Yeah, we have had a number of corporate collapses. Adrian, we've got high flux and we've got the number, right? And we have had a lot of companies where the boards are not, rising to the expectation of the shareholders. SID at the moment functions as a society or an association for directors. You train them, but it is not functioning like Law Society or ISCA. I would like to see, before I close my eyes, SID having some teeth, where you actually have to have directors being members of SID, and that you will then have the authority to supervise the director. And should things go wrong, now, what has happened in these cases, because some directors went to sleep, they allowed one or two to control, or the CEO to be the captain and control the whole situation, and they miss the mark, and then you have corporate collapse. I feel that a body like SID should have the authority to actually supervise the directors. What have you to say, both of you?
Adrian?
Yeah.
Do you want to go
Yeah,
first?
maybe I'll start and then you
Yes.
can explain our accreditation program. But I actually, the aspiration is to elevate directorship into a profession.
Yes.
And to professionalize it, you need training, you need standards, and more importantly, like you said, you need accountability.
Yes.
The same for doctors, lawyers, engineers, accountants, architects. If they actually breach their duties or they drop the ball, they're negligent, they don't meet certain standards, professional standards, the medical council can take action, they can suspend, disbar, or
Law Society.
Law
Yes.
Society can do the same. The engineers, everyone has a self-regulating body that ensures professional standards are met, right? So right now, we don't have that for directors. To do that, we need a bit more teeth, like you say, and we need to be able to enforce mandatory training, mandatory CPT, make people sit for exams. Directors would not like it, but I think it's part and parcel of what we hope to do to professionalize it. And accreditation is our first step.
Yes.
Maybe Suyen can explain a bit more.
Well, I wrote a commentary supporting that.
Yes.
Accreditation is important. Yes, Suyan.
I
Yes.
know. I think we all want the same outcome. I
Yeah.
think the directorship profession, as it were, in Singapore is pretty young compared to, let's say, the UK, right, which has had a much longer history around this notion of professionalism. I completely concur with the points that Adrian met, and the idea behind accreditation is that somebody should have a minimum level of competency, as proven through training, passing certain exams in order to take on a board role. It's a little bit like having a driver's license. It doesn't mean that just because you have a driver's license mean you might not get into an accident. You might, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a driver's license. Everybody should still go through the process of learning how to drive, pass the exam so that you can be deemed safe on the road, right? So I think this is the intention behind accreditation. And I think the other thing that I would touch on is, as this dialogue has indicated, there are a lot of things that directors need to be concerned about because the world that companies are operating is actually quite complex. So the idea behind accreditation is to ensure that directors have this sort of 360 view of everything that it takes to be an effective functioning director.
Yeah.
Might come up. They may not understand technology, but they better learn technology.
Yeah, it will give comfort to minority shareholders, so the retail investors, that they are good men, well informed, well educated, and well supervised on the board. So anyway, there is a question here from our audience. Is an external audit of board of directors mandated by SGX? Also, can internal audit BOD performance, and how can you enable internal audit to assess the BOD? Can internal audit assess the BOD?
Yeah, so there isn't an audit required, both internal and external. So I think Suyen touched upon board performance evaluation, and the code requires that. But it's largely self-assessment right now, and I think overseas codes have moved towards having external assessors, external reviews conducted. In the UK, I understand that for the larger UK listed companies, now the UK code requires an externally facilitated review at least once every 3 years. So we're probably going to move in that direction, but not yet. Yeah.
Yeah, good. There's one more question. There seems to be many more board fights and stakeholders requisitioning EGMs to overthrow existing boards. What advice do you have for minority shareholders in gauging which board is better? How can you tell?
Wow, tough one.
Yeah.
I honestly think that shareholders will find it difficult to assess who are the good guys in white hats and who are the bad guys in dark hats, because the quality of the director cannot be seen from the external facade, right? It's only his past conduct. So I think we'll just have to listen to what the director promises and hold him to it. Yeah.
Okay, so is there sufficient laws and regulations regulating the board of directors? You have the Companies Act, you have the Corporate Governance Code, which is not prescriptive. What else? You have the listing rules, you know, and you have the MAS regulations for criminal actions. So, you know,
Well,
so
actually,
do we have enough?
yeah, SID has a board guide, and we have a lot of policies and procedures that will govern board behavior. So we recommend that you have an ethics code, you have an anti-bribery code, what you do with and you encounter fraud. So it's not just the Companies Act and the code and the listing rules, but SID believes that boards should adopt best practices and have policies and procedures to guide your conduct. For example, they should have a no exception rule to bribery and corruption, right?
Yes.
And how do you deal with gifts and entertainment within the company? How is that
Gratification is the
monitored?
word.
Yeah, that's a big thing now, right? So yeah.
Yes.
I think
So,
the policies and the
Suyan,
regulations.
you know, it is all well and good. We've talked about all this, but what is your aspiration, or what do you think, Suyan, that should happen more other than accreditation?
Yeah.
You know, what is your wish list?
I think there's been a lot said about board diversity. I want to expand that lens a little bit to basically talk about how to construct an effective and well-functioning board. And I think there's some questions around this as well, which is how do you decide who the boards are? What I think we would like to see is a rigorous process that links the company's strategy to the kind of expertise that is required on the board. As opposed to, you know, let me bring in this person that I know, because the person that you know might be a wonderful person, just may not have the right capabilities for the right. So starting with that very strategic view, and then looking at then what types of directors, that director composition is very critical, and then making sure that everybody has that benchmark of standards. And then the last thing I would say is around board culture. So much of, I think, whether a board is well functioning or not comes down to the quality of discussion in the boardroom. And so how do you drive quality of discussion in the boardroom? Well, if you have a board chair that basically shuts down every idea and comment, well, you're not going to have a very constructive conversation, right, about shifts in strategy and direction, the sort of the know-it-all chairman. But if you have a conducive environment where you're really getting in different perspectives and you're able to push the envelope, then I think you can actually improve the performance of a company, because, you know, no one person can know everything, right? So the purpose of having a board is to have those checks and balances in place, different views, different experiences to take the company forward.
Yeah, maybe I can.
Yes.
Yeah,
please.
David, maybe I can just share my perspective on the question about, you know, I think one greatest challenge right now for boards is how do we increase shareholder value? And I think a lot of independent directors who get on boards are a bit consumed by compliance issues, and they don't focus enough on the performance issues and how to grow and improve the share price. And, you know, I see what Japan and Korea have done, and the stock exchanges there have required listed boards to come up with a plan to improve shareholder value. Yeah, TSR, right?
Right.
Yeah. So they've used a carrot and stick approach, you know. And I thought those are interesting ideas. And my own experience in listed boards here is somehow the family that owns the majority stake actually are not against shareholder value because they are the biggest shareholder. It's just that they have a different timeline. Their time horizon is long-term, it's generational. So they are prepared to wait. So shareholders are usually a little bit more impatient. They want the dividends now, but majority shareholders saying, I don't want to declare so much dividend. I want to invest in growth for the future. So that's the clash in time horizons, I feel, is one issue.
I think the answer is shareholder activism. As you saw in in a recent case where shareholders are not happy about, although the company is doing very well, and NTA is good and the governance is good, but share value is poor, and they are putting resolutions at the next meeting to ask for explanation as to why shareholder value has nothing has been done, right?
Yeah, I saw that. They asked
Yeah.
for withholding of director fees until share price goes up. That's a very interesting approach, I must say.
Yeah, I mean,
It
yeah,
won't
and then
pass unless the major shareholder agrees, but I mean, it's an
yeah,
interesting idea.
But
I'm
also,
happy to say the board is listening. But
Okay.
yes, Suyan, yes, Suyan.
I think the other thing that's really important is, whether a shareholder or a minority shareholder or majority shareholder, is to really try and see other perspectives. I do think that boards and shareholders are at risk of only seeing one perspective, which is whatever dominant narrative that they have. But the reality is that, running a company and trying to create value is complex. And so the trade-offs that one has to make with, short-term vis-a-vis long-term are very, very important questions that the board needs to wrestle with. And it doesn't mean that long-term is good and short-term is bad, or short-term is good and long-term is bad, but to be to really wrestle with the issue in its totality. And so I think shareholders need to do the same, which is, be able to look at the issue from multiple angles. Otherwise, there may be unintended consequences, right? You think that this is for good, but actually it may result in longer term destruction of value.
So in some companies still you have chairman who also CEO. And, I think the code does prescribe the appointment of a senior director who would oversee to ensure, have a foresight on the board to ensure there's no conflict. So what is your view? What exactly are their roles? And being, holding the dual roles, do you think there's a conflict of interest? There's a perceived conflict of interest, but is it being addressed adequately?
Well, that's why you want to have a lead independent director in those kind of
Yes.
circumstances to provide that balance.
Are they sufficiently enabled, or are they able to supervise? I mean, you have a strong chairman and then a strong majority shareholder. What's the point having a lead independent director whose voice is not heard?
I think it still comes back to the attitude of the major shareholder, the chair, CEO, and how open they are. So they really need to see that the directors, the independent directors, including the lead independent directors, add value. So the other side of it would be, as a director, you need to be able to add value as well, right? So if you can add value, then I think that's kind of the starting point.
Yeah, and I think a lead ID
yes.
does give that person a little bit more status and have to discuss things with the chairman and the major shareholder.
Yes.
And that the appointment itself shows that, look, his word should be given enough weight in the boardroom.
Yes.
So I think that's a good requirement.
Have you served on a board where chairman and CEO are the same?
Yes. I think both of us have. Yep.
Yeah. It's not always bad. It's not always bad. I think if he's a good guy, he's a good guy.
Yes.
Yes.
If it comes down to the openness, right? The openness to other views, being able to put in place board process that allows for people to speak, as opposed to being the only one who speaks and nobody else speaks. Okay, it's a very different tone. But yeah, no, I've been on several boards where you've got chair and CEO, but they're respectful, all right, of the views. They're respectful of the people, but more respectful of the views that may be different from theirs.
Yes. Well, they have revisited here. There's a question about that Great Eastern, but given the circumstance in which most of the shares are tightly controlled by a majority shareholder, what other avenues are available for these minority shareholders? Can the ID actually help in this situation, or the IDs not help in that situation to allow the rejection of requests for measures to be taken to improve shareholder value? That's number one, and there has been no real effort they have met, they've talked, but they are not happy. So in that situation, if you're on the board, Suyan, what would you be doing?
Well, I think it's this is where shareholder engagement is important. Because I think, it's the whole analogy of we're all touching like the blind men touching different parts of the elephant, and different people will legitimately look at a similar issue with different views. So
Yes.
even, so let's say the concerns expressed by minority shareholders are great, are absolutely valid, but equally, the majority shareholder view is probably quite valid as well. So how
Yes.
do you come to an understanding of what you're trying to, accomplish, and how do
Yes.
they ultimately align? And that's where I come in with your question earlier about communication. So important, because
Mm.
otherwise, kind of, I mean, we sort of tend to assume that somebody of a different view is wrong, right? As opposed to, let's say, okay, actually, we're just looking at this in different ways, and how do we bridge? And so the point that
Mm.
about the being that bridge, the IDs being the bridge between the major shareholder, the minority shareholders, so that you can forge a comfortable path forward is quite critical.
Yes, Adrian, how can a decision be made if board members cannot agree among themselves on certain issues? How often do directors disagree with the chairman or the majority shareholder on issues they feel strongly about?
Yeah, I think if you are effective director, you will find a way to actually have the right forum to air out your disagreements. In the Singapore and Asian context, it's usually not in the boardroom. It's not during a formal board meeting. So, I've served on Japanese boards, I've served on boards with Chinese shareholders, and the approach is very different. Usually, it involves a lot of outside the boardroom discussions, usually facilitated by some fluids that will help with meeting of minds. So
Yeah.
I think is to get comfortable, and if the most important element in the boardroom and outside the boardroom is trust. If the chairman or the major shareholders and executive directors trust that you're not out there to stab them in the back, but you're there to really further the interests of the company, and you can walk the talk by proving to them that this is good for them and good for minority shareholders too, then you've done your job. So it's how you disagree. In the Asian context, disagreement doesn't mean banging table and
Yes.
having it out. It is gently persuasion and using intermediaries sometimes, using a little bit more subtle ways to get your point across.
Yes.
And I think,
But
like any form of disagreement, it is sometimes a misalignment rather than a outright disagreement. And we're just seeing things through different lenses, right? So I think I completely concur with Adrian's point that it's about having those conversations that help to see, well, what is it that I'm missing, right? And all parties need to go through that process. And I think the other thing I would say is sincerity of intent. I think for a board director, yes, you go in and you want to, you have a fiduciary role towards the company, but really care enough about the company in terms of what the company's trying to accomplish. If everyone's intentions are aligned with we're trying to do the right thing for the company and all its shareholders, that's a good starting point, right? And then you sort of put the time into understanding the business, you put the time into understanding the dynamics between the people. Organizations can be political places, right? I mean, within the organization. So how do you understand how to navigate whatever agendas there may be and perspectives they are to come to a good landing?
well, there's another question. Isn't it true that the tenure of office of directors depends largely on how they support the majority shareholder or the executive directors? This has come up to me many, many times, that directors are beholden to the major shareholders. I mean, there are good companies and bad companies, as you said, Suyan. I mean, but still, the minority look at it as a hopeless situation. This guy's sold to the majority shareholder. Is that true? And have you had the experience of directors actually standing up to majority shareholder?
Oh, I think by and large, IDs in Singapore do try to be people
Independent?
who will stand up for their principles, right? I
Right.
think the only thing that the ID has actually is its reputation. And honestly, not many will compromise that easily. Uh, Although, of course, there are some. and some bad apples sometimes taint the reputation of everyone else. But I think by and large, IDs will stand up and vote without fear or favor. And in some cases, that has resulted in majority shareholders voting them out of the board.
Yeah,
and
or
I think
they're
it's
walking out, like
or they
I
walk
think the
out.
Robinson case, well, their independent directors walked out, right?
Yeah, there have been
so
quite a few cases. Yeah.
they should do that, and they should inform the investors. Now, last question. We have come to almost the end of the show, but this last question, speaking about re-election of directors, is it true that directors of REITs are not required to stand for re-election? That's the first question. How do we then hold directors of REITs accountable? Shouldn't the regulation regarding REITs be improved and make it compulsory for all REITs directors to face re-election, especially in the face of many failing REITs like EC World and Dasin, etc.? Adrian.
Yeah, I do not disagree. I think REIT directors should stand for re-election, and some have voluntarily put their directors up for re-election. Not all have done so. So yeah, I'll be supportive of a change of regulation to make it consistent. Yeah, it's the unique nature of the REIT as a trust and the manager being separate. So unlike a normal listed company. But I think the only way for shareholders then to hold the company and the directors accountable is that AGM still quiz them and hold them to their word.
Well, Suyen, your last wise words for investors regarding board of directors and the way it functions. Everything we've covered, but how would you say, what would you say as your parting words tonight?
So I think one lead indicator that investors can use is when you're asking questions, is ask whether, how the board was constructed and whether the board directors are accredited. We talked earlier about standards.
Yes.
That starts driving an expectation, because, that's what minority shareholders can do, right? This is something I expect. So are you, how many of your board directors are accredited? That gives you a bit of a sense of how, how diligent the board is around ensuring that they are continuously refreshing. Just because you took a course, 5 years ago doesn't mean that you're still current. So, you need to continue to keep up with technology and AI and sustainability. We didn't even touch about that, right? All these different issues, and accreditation helps to do that.
Adrian.
Yeah, I fully support what Suyen said, because having their directors accredited shows that the company is serious about governance, right? But from the flip side also, I would again repeat what I said, is to try to ask directors how they intend to improve shareholder value. I think from an investor perspective, it's just understanding what the business model and the approach is. It may be different. You may not get a spike in dividends. Your yield may not go up, but understanding how the board constructs its shareholder return model will be helpful to investors. Well,
SIAS members and shareholders of companies who attended tonight's event forum, we will agree that we've been very well informed and educated by Adrian and Suyen, very experienced directors. And thank you for your time, both of you, spending your time with us. Thank you for attending, participants. Keep attending our forums. Keep looking out for our events. SIAS will continue to, provide interesting programs like tonight. Thank you, Suyen and Adrian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David.
David,
Good night.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.